Good morning, Bangkok. Well done to those of you who've come here very early this morning. I very much appreciate you joining me. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about AI openness. Before I get there, as the lady who introduced me very kindly said, I edited a book, which is probably the worst thing I've ever done. It's very hard work. I had 26 authors, it's 640 pages long, and I'm not trying to sell it to you. You can download it free using the QR code. If you look at it, you're going to be very disappointed because there's nothing in it about AI. And there's nothing in it about AI because we set the book 7 years ago. So when we do the next edition, obviously AI will run all the way through. But 7 years ago, we thought AI was irrelevant. And I lead an organization called Open UK, which is a country organization, a policy organization. We bring the community together. We do legal and policy work to try and influence the government to have good laws for open source in the UK. And then we collaborate globally, which is why I end up coming to things like this to meet all of you in a city like Bangkok. So thank you very much for having me. And this might not be where you expect the day AI to start, but I think it's really important that we think about open source when we talk about openness and AI. And the starting point for that open source is understanding what we mean by open source software, right? And we've all known what open source software is for almost 30 years because we have an open source definition that is established and accepted. And what this definition does is set the base for our licensing of open source software. So open source software is software which is distributed on a license that complies with this definition. Now, I often joke that we should all recite it together because I can't do it and none of you can do it. Nobody knows the exact terms word by word. Even Bruce Perens, who wrote it, I've sat with Bruce and he's been looking at the notes to check what it says. And I think for everybody, there is something different that is really important to them. So the distribution of the code on these licenses is very important. But for me, the key thing about it is 5 and 6. And what 5 and 6 effectively say is that anyone can use that software for any purpose. There is no restriction. Now, that doesn't mean that laws won't apply. Laws override or trump the licensing. But 5 and 6 mean that you can rely on a free flow, that when you get open source software, you can take it, you can use it for any purpose, so long as you're doing something legal. And you don't have to worry about any licensing, any additional payments, anything else. There is this beautiful free flow. And that free flow is what's caused the adoption in the ecosystem. It's what's caused the pace of open source adoption in the last 5-10 years, where today we see 96% of software stacks having dependencies on open source. We see 76% of all software that's used in the stack being open source. Now, there is a challenge with this free flow, and that challenge with the free flow is generally around commercialization. And the challenge is working out, if you use open source as the basis for a commercial business, how you monetize it. Because open source isn't a business model. It's a way of licensing software. It's a way of creating software, but it is not a business model. And what we've seen is friction introduced into that free flow by terms that restrict commercialization. And we often see this in companies as they grow, as the IPO, as the VCs want them to make more money. It's not that they're not making money. So companies like Elastic, when in 2021, Shay Bannon shifted Elasticsearch away from an open source license onto SSPL. When that happened, they were very profitable, but they thought they could make more money by being non-open source. And what we've seen in the last year is research that shows that actually they don't know if they are making more. It's unlikely that they are. However, what you see here is friction. And that friction, a term that says you cannot use this code commercially in certain situations, interrupts the free flow. And that's super important because if somebody implies that the code is open source and it's not, effectively what you're doing is open washing. Now, open washing is when you imply that it has this free flow, when it has the open source goodness, but it doesn't really, because the friction is in the supply chain, in the ecosystem. And open washing is a term that I never thought we would see in the mainstream. And then last year, both The Economist and the New York Times actually wrote about it. And they wrote about it because of AI. So what's happened in the last couple of years? Well, in March 2023, the conversation about open source became relevant, so 2 years ago. And in those 2 years, what we've seen is ChatGPT-4, which was not OpenAI, despite the fact that the company is called OpenAI. That's the biggest misnomer, the biggest confusion in history. Although OpenAI was originally set up to be an open source not-for-profit, and Elon Musk claims that that has a lot to do with him, by the time GPT-4 was released in March 23, it was very, very much a closed piece of software. But what it did was start things moving. So we then saw Llama, the first Llama, released openly for research purposes. So not open source, but released with a restriction around how it was used. Wouldn't make the open source software definition. But it was leaked. And when it was leaked, what we saw between March and May was a pace of innovation that was unprecedented in AI. And what we saw was this leaked memo from Google, which I think sums the whole thing up beautifully. We saw the big techs who'd invested millions and billions of dollars realizing that they could not compete with the open communities if you gave them the tools, that the innovation that the open communities would do was faster through its collaboration than anything big tech could do. And what they said is we have no moat. And when they say moat, they mean the water around a castle, the moat that protects it so that it, I have no slides, I do. So it's the moat around the castle that protects it, that stops people coming through. And usually in tech, that's intellectual property. It's the way you protect your innovation from others. And what they were saying was we have no moat. We're unable to protect ourselves from the open communities because their innovation is so good. We cannot finesse our products enough to be able to sell them in competition to that open output. So by July, we saw Zuckerberg being questioned about this. And then we saw Llama 2 launch on a non-open source license. Now you'll see open organization's logo there. And we were the only open source organization to support this. And what we supported, because we have a broad remit that isn't just open source, it's open technology. So software, hardware, data, standards, AI, everything that's open. And when we supported this, we signed up to a statement, as everybody who was working on Llama 2's launch did. And you will see the words open source are not used there anywhere. They called it open innovation because it has restrictions. It has an acceptable use policy, and it has a restriction on 700 million users or more. Now that creates a friction in the supply chain, but it also means for Meta that whoever wins, they win. Because anybody who gets 700 million users or more has to go back to Meta and get a commercial license. Despite all of that, I and my board think we did the right thing, because this release was so significant and what it has then led to. It moved the needle forward. It changed things in AI. So if you're interested in more, I wrote this piece about why it's not open source. But then we see in January 2024, I think the next most significant change with the launch of R1 from DeepSeek. Now that is on an open source license, at least the weights are, but it was created by distilling existing open AI. So Quark and Llama 2 were used as the basis for this. If Llama 2 had not been distributed openly, DeepSeek R1 would not have happened. So that's super important. And when you look at R1, what you see is a 5 million cost for something that previously had cost 100 million. So it took the market down. NVIDIA's share price went down 17% in 24 hours. It shifted things. And that impact, although we see a settling again afterwards, that impact is super significant, because what we see Sam Altman saying that he's on the wrong side of history. I'm going to have this printed on a t-shirt and wear it everywhere I go, because this is super important. The wrong side of history when it comes to open weights. Now, what you'll notice is that they're not talking about open source here, they're talking about open weights. And things start to change, and we start to see more conversations about that. Following DeepSeek's R1, almost immediately, Hugging Face take those open weights and try to work out what was going on. How did they get here? And they use the instructions that were also openly shared with different data to reproduce a truly open version. And then we saw, like 2 weeks ago, I think, I'm losing track of time, DeepSeek then shared a number of different tools that help to build more openness in AI by sharing a repo each day that was truly open source, all shared on an MIT-approved license. But what we've seen over the last couple of years, whilst all of this innovation has been happening even, we've seen a huge battle going on about what should and should not be called open source in AI. And we've seen the Open Source Initiative come up with a definition, which was published last October. People have very different views on that. Their views, I guess, cause friction in the ecosystem. It's not necessarily a good thing. And it hasn't had a massive scale of adoption. We then see the Free Software Foundation also creating a definition of their own. And we see more and more talking about the confusion that's being caused. So my personal view is that there's a better approach, and that better approach is to look at the component parts, look at the weights, look at the data, look at the different aspects of AI to see which pieces are open, whether they're partly open, fully open, or closed, and what that means. And that allows you to do a better risk assessment. In the meantime, we've seen the policymakers and the regulators try to understand what AI means, but also what openness means. And we saw the EU in May last year create the first AI legislation. And then we saw in October last year, the White House under Biden create this executive order, followed swiftly last summer by more confirmation that open source was good. And then in January, this is Biden's executive order gone. So Trump's administration has shifted things. We're expecting a new executive order in the next few months, but nobody knows what that will say. China, like the UK, is working on IP. For the last 18 months, we've seen the UK play quite a significant part. We hosted and set up the first AI Summit focused on safety. Last May, we open sourced something called Inspect, and Inspect is the first major tool around governance of AI that's been released. And it's an evaluation platform from the UK's what was called the AI Safety Institute. We saw Rishi Sunak, the then Prime Minister, support that, saying the UK supports open source and we won't legislate. And then a change in government. And that change in government led to a proposal for legislation. We haven't had legislation. We have had an Opportunities Action Plan right before the Paris AI Action Summit. And this is a report. I was, I think, one of 2 people from Openness who were invited to the summit who didn't work for big corporates. So I was there and the lady from Luther were there. So this report tells you about what went on at the summit. And what we saw was a shift to France as a leader in AI openness in Europe from the UK, but working quite closely with the UK. However, the UK did not sign up to the summit declaration, and the US did not. And immediately afterwards, there was a shift from safety to security. And it's really notable that the UK, it's very closely aligned with the US on AI, has not produced its legislation. And I know that the regulators were expecting to share it in December, but I think that's because of the shift in what the content will be. At the summit, we saw 2 important open source things shared. We saw Roost, which creates more of these governance tools for open source, and they use the strapline tools, not rules, and they focus on having technical solutions for open source problems. And we saw Current AI, which was launched with $500 million and is looking to have $2.5 billion in the next 5 years. Importantly, this index, if you haven't seen it, Tortoise shows the status of AI openness globally, and it shows that France and these initiatives around the summit have pushed ahead to become Europe's #1. But I don't worry too much because the UK still has more GitHub accounts per capita than any country in the world, and over 4 million accounts, and the biggest contribution to open source. And I think the one thing that I would ask you to take away from my brief talk this morning is Sam Altman's quote. Yes, I will print it on a t-shirt, but more importantly, the CEO and founder of the biggest closed AI company in the world thinks he's on the wrong side of history when it comes to open source, and that he should have at least an open weight strategy. If any of you are based in Europe, do join Open UK next year at our State of OpenCon, and you can contact me here. Thank you very much for joining me.